In this lecture, we're going to look at triggers in MySQL. A trigger is a block of SQL code that automatically gets executed before or after an insert, update, or delete statement. Quite often, we use triggers to enforce data consistency. For example, in our SQL Store database, we can have multiple payments towards a given invoice. Now, in this table, we have this payment total column, and the value that we have in this column should be equal to the sum of all the payments for this invoice. So whenever we insert a new record in the payments table, we should make sure that the payment total column in the invoices table gets updated. And this is where we use a trigger. Let me show you how to do this. So first, we need to change the default delimiter. Then we use the create trigger statement. We give our trigger a name, like payments after insert. And this basically means that this trigger is associated with the payments table and is fired after we insert a record. This is a convention that a lot of people use to name their triggers. So first we specify the table name, then we type after or before, and this indicates whether the trigger is fired after or before a SQL statement. And finally, we have the type of the SQL statement that will fire this trigger, okay? Now, this is just a name, it has no impact. So we should explicitly tell MySQL that we want this trigger to be fired after an insert statement on the payments table. So here we type after insert on payments. Here we could also use before. In this example, we're going to go with after. We could also use update or delete here, depending on what we're trying to implement. So let's go with insert. Next, we need to type for each row. And this means that this trigger gets fired for each row that is affected. So if we insert 5 rows, it will get triggered for each row. Now, some database management systems also support table level triggers that get fired only once. So if we insert 1 row or 5 rows, the trigger gets fired only once. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this, MySQL doesn't support this. Now we type begin and end to indicate the body of this trigger. And obviously here we need to type our new delimiter and then change it back to a semicolon. Now here in the body of this trigger, we can write any SQL code to modify our data for consistency. We can write raw SQL here or call a store procedure. Now in this example, we're going to update the invoices table and increase the payment total amount. So we set payment underline total to payment total plus. Now we need to get the new value, the new payment amount. So here we use the new keyword, and this returns the row that was just inserted. We also have the old keyword, and this is useful when we are updating or deleting a row. So the old keyword will return the old row with the old values. Now here we're going to use the new keyword, and using a dot, we can access individual attributes. In this case, amount. So just to clarify this, take a look at the payments table. In this table, we have the amount column. So whenever we insert a new record in this table, then using new.amount, we can access the amount of this new payment, okay? Next, we need to add a where clause. We want to update a particular invoice, right? So where invoice ID equals, once again, we use the new keyword to get the invoice ID. And finally, we terminate this with a semicolon. Now, just one thing before we test our new trigger. In this trigger, we can modify data in any tables except the table that this trigger is for. Otherwise, we'll end up with an infinite loop because this trigger will fire itself. So we can modify data in any tables except this table here. All right, now let's create our new trigger. Beautiful. So back to our invoices table. Look at invoice with the ID 3. On my machine, the payment total is 0. I'm going to make a $10 payment towards this invoice. And then I'm going to come back here. I expect the payment total to be updated automatically. So let's open a new query window and insert into the payments table. What values do we need here? Let's look at the columns. First, we need the payment ID. For this, I'm going to use default So MySQL would generate an ID for us. For the client ID, I'm going to use 5. For invoice ID, I'm going to use 3. Then I'm going to use 2019 January 1st for the date. I'm going to use 10 for the amount, and finally 1 for the payment method. All right, let's execute this. Beautiful. Back to the invoices table. I'm going to refresh the result. Now you can see the payment total for this invoice was automatically updated. This is where our trigger kicked in. Now for your exercise, create a trigger that gets fired when we delete a payment. This trigger does the opposite of the trigger that we just created, so it should reduce the total payment amount. All right, first we need to change the default delimiter. Then we create a trigger called payments after delete. Here we type after delete on payments. For each row, this is what we're going to do, begin and end. Here we use the new delimiter and then change it back to a semicolon. Now in the body of this trigger, we want to update the invoices table and set the payment total amount, total, to payment total minus. Here we use the old keyword to get the values in the row that was deleted. So old.amount, where invoice ID equals old.invoice ID. As simple as that. Let's create this trigger. All right. Now I'm going to create the payment that we just created. So this invoice number 3, its payment total should be updated to 0. Back to the navigator panel, let's look at the payments table. Scroll to the bottom. So here's the new payment that we created. On my machine, that's payment number 10, where I contributed $10 for invoice number 3. So in this window, I'm going to delete from payments where payment ID equals 10. Let's execute this statement. Beautiful. Now back to the invoices table. I'm going to refresh the result. You can see the payment total for this invoice is updated to 0. We have created a couple of triggers so far, but unfortunately in MySQL Workbench, there is no way to visually see the triggers we have created. Here we can only see the tables, views, stored procedures, and functions. But don't worry, we can use the show triggers statement to view all triggers in the current database. Take a look. So here we can see various attributes about each trigger. We can see the trigger name, the event, which can be insert, update, or delete, the table. Here's the code for the trigger. And we also have the timing, which can be before or after, as well as the creation date time for each trigger. Here we can also filter the result. For example, if we only want to see the triggers associated with the payments table, we can use the like operator like this, like payments %. So this will return triggers that have a name with this pattern. So if you follow the convention that I told you about earlier, with this technique, you can easily find the triggers associated with a given table. Here's the convention for your reference. First, we add the table name, then before or after, and finally the type of the SQL statement, which can be insert, update, or delete. Dropping triggers is very easy. It's very similar to dropping stored procedures. So we use the drop trigger statement. Optionally and ideally, we use the if exists keywords, and then we type the name of our trigger, payments after insert. So as a best practice, we should have our drop and create statements in one script file that is also checked into a source code repository. So not only can everyone on the team create the same database on their machine, but over time, we can view the history of changes to our database. So I'm going to grab this statement and put it over here like this. So first we have the drop statement, and then we create the trigger. You have seen how we can use triggers for enforcing data consistency. Another common use case for triggers is logging changes to the data for auditing. For example, whenever someone inserts or deletes a record, we can log that somewhere So later we can come back and see who made what changes when. So I've attached a SQL script to this lecture. You can download it right below this video. When you open that script, you're going to see something like this. Here we're using the create table statement to create a new table. We'll look at creating tables later in the course. For now, just execute this script. All right, now we should have a new table in this database. Let's refresh this view. There you go. Payments audit. In this table, we have these columns: client ID, date, amount, action type, which can be insert, update, or delete, as well as action date that specifies when this action was performed. Now, this is a very simplified approach to auditing, but it should give you an idea of how we can use triggers for logging changes. Now, back to our triggers. Here we have this trigger, payments after insert. After we update the invoices table, we can insert a new record in our audit table. So it looks like this. Insert into payments underline audit, values. What values do we need to supply here? Client ID, date, amount. Let's pass these. So I'm going to get these from the new row, new.client ID, new.date, and new.amount. Then we need to supply the type of the action. For this, I'm going to pass a string like this. Insert. And finally, for the action date, we call the now function to get the current date time. Finally, let's terminate this with a semicolon. And now let's recreate this trigger. Beautiful. I'm going to make a similar change to the other trigger. So let's copy these two lines for inserting a record in the payments audit table. Then we go to our other trigger called payments after delete. And note that in the script, we have the drop trigger statement before the create trigger statement. So we can recreate it, okay? Now, let me zoom out. So after we update the invoices table, then we insert a new record in our audit table. Now in this trigger, we're dealing with a row that was deleted. So we need to replace the new keyword with the old keyword, like this. And instead of insert, we're going to use delete. So this indicates that a row was deleted. And here we have the values of the row that was deleted, so we can recover it later. All right, now let's recreate this trigger as well. Beautiful. Now I'm going to create a new payment, insert into payments with these values. Default, 5 for the client, 3 for the invoice, 2019, January 1st for the date, 10 for the amount, and 1 for the payment method. Execute. Now let's take a look at our audit table. So now we know that at this date time, a new record was inserted into this table, and here are the original values. Now we can create another trigger that will get fired after updating a payment. Now let me delete this new payment. So back to the payments table. What is the ID of this payment? That is payment number 11. So let's delete from the payments table where payment ID equals 11. All right, now back to our audit table. Let's refresh the result. We have another record here that tells us at this date time, a record was deleted, and here are the values for this record. So this is very powerful. Now, once again, I've simplified this audit table so you better understand how we can use triggers to log changes. In a real-world application, you may want to log changes in many tables. So in that case, you shouldn't create a separate audit table for each table in your database. That's very repetitive. Instead, you need a general structure for logging changes, but let's not worry about it yet. Later in the course, when we talk about database design, you will learn how to design general audit tables. So this concludes our discussion about triggers. Next, we'll look at events. In this lecture, we're going to look at events in MySQL. An event is a task or a block of SQL code that gets executed according to a schedule. It can get executed once or on a regular basis, like every day at 10 a.m. or once a month, and so on. So with events, we can automate database maintenance tasks such as deleting stale data or copying data from one table into an archive table or aggregating data to generate reports. So events are very powerful. Now, before we can schedule an event, we need to turn on MySQL Event Scheduler. That's basically a process that runs in the background and it constantly looks for events to execute. Let me show you. So here we type show variables, and here we can see all the system variables in MySQL. As you can see, we have quite a few variables here. We only want to see the event scheduler variable. So here we use the like operator, like event %. So we want to see only the variables whose names start with event, right? Take a look. Here we have event scheduler, which is set to on by default. At your organization, this might be turned off to save system resources. If that's the case, you can turn it on using the set statement. So we type set global event scheduler. We set this to on. Or if you don't want to use events, you can turn this off to save system resources. So you're not going to have that background process that is constantly checking for events to execute. Okay? Now let me show you how to create an event. First, we need to change the default delimiter. Then we use the create event statement. We give our event a name like yearly, delete, stale, audit, rows. So it's a good practice to start our event's name with this interval, like hourly, daily, monthly, or once if this event is going to get triggered only once. With this convention, we can easily find all the events that get triggered every month or every year or once. So after the event name, we type on schedule. And here we're going to provide a schedule for this event. How often do we want to execute this task? Once or on a regular basis? If you want to execute it only once, here we use the at keyword followed by a datetime value, like 2019, May 1st. That's one way. If you want to execute this on a regular basis, instead of the at keyword, we use the every keyword with an interval, like every 1 hour or every 2 days or every 1 year, depending on what we want to implement, every 1 year. Now here we can optionally give it a start time. Start, let's say, 2019, January 1st. We can also optionally specify an end time. So ends, let's say 2029, January 1st. So both these parts are optional, okay? Then we type do followed by begin and end. And obviously here we need to type our new delimiter and then change the default delimiter back to a semicolon. Now in the body of this event, we can write code like this. Delete from payments underline audit, where action underline date is less than, we get the current date time and then subtract 1 year from it. So interval 1 year. Earlier you learned about the date add and date sub functions. This expression that we have here is exactly equivalent to using the date add or date sub functions. For example, here we could call date add, pass the current date time, and then interval 1 year. Well, here we should pass a negative value to go back 1 year, or we could use the date sub function and pass a positive value here, like this. We can also calculate the date like this. That's easier, right? So with this event, we're going to delete all the audit records that are older than 1 year, okay? Let's go ahead and create this event. Beautiful. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to view, drop, or alter your events. To view the events in the current database, we use the show events statement. Take a look. Here we can see all the events and their characteristics. For example, in SQL Invoicing Database, we have this event. As you can see, it's a recurring event. Here we have the interval for this event. So it's going to get executed every 1 year. And you also have the start and end time for this event. Now, earlier I told you that it's a good practice to start your event's name with their interval, like hourly, monthly, yearly, or once for one-time events. With this convention, we can easily filter events using the like operator. For example, to view the events that get triggered every year, we can write like yearly %. Pretty useful. Now, to drop an event, we use the drop event statement. So drop event, if exists, and then we specify the name, like yearly, delete, stale, audit, rows. We also have the alter event statement to make changes to an event without the need to drop and recreate it. And the syntax is exactly the same as the create event statement. So instead of create event, we can use alter event. Then we can change the schedule for this event. We can also change the SQL statements that will be executed when this event is triggered. Pretty straightforward. But we can also use the alter event statement to temporarily enable or disable an event. Let me show you. So here we can type alter event, yearly, delete, stale, audit rows. Then we type disable. Or later on, we can come back here and enable this event like this. So that concludes our discussion about events. As you have seen, we use events to automate database maintenance tasks. In the next section, we're going to look at transactions.